Good afternoon. We are the Senate Finance Committee. Today is Thursday, January 26, 2023. We're going to start with a fiscal briefing from the Department of Legislative Services Office of Policy Analysis. David Romans, you can come forward and feel free to bring anyone with you like, and you have the floor. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ben is going to help move through the document for us on the screen. I think you have hard copies, though, so I will go ahead and get started. So this is kind of a high-level overview. This is a very big, thick document that's scary-looking on the desk. I'm just going to go through about the first 6 pages, which gives you the high-level overview, and then I'm happy to answer any questions the committee has. So on that first page at the very top, or I guess it's page maybe 3, the first page with actual text, shows the budget actually declines to about almost $63 billion in fiscal '24 across all funds, a 2% decrease. It decreases primarily because there's less federal funding this year. There was a lot of federal stimulus money that passed through the budget in fiscal '22 and '23, and that's beginning to dissipate in fiscal '24. A particular note, perhaps, to this committee is in the Medicaid program, we've been getting an extra 6.2% match on Medicaid since the pandemic began. So instead of getting a 50% federal match for our Medicaid costs, we were getting 56%. That is being phased out. Congress passed a bill in December that phases that out by the end of this calendar year, and phases it down, so we'll be getting less and less federal funding. So that's one of the big reasons you see the federal dollars decline in the chart. State general fund dollars are down, partly because we just have less of a surplus than we did a year ago. But also because last year the General Assembly appropriated $2 billion into the rainy day fund. And this year, the General Assembly is appropriating the governor is proposing no appropriation to the rainy day fund, so there's less money going into savings. Overall, actually, if you take the rainy day fund appropriations out of the budget, it actually grows a couple of percentage points. With all that accounting said, the governor is leaving a fund balance at the end of fiscal '24 under his proposal of $820 million in the general fund. That's an extraordinary fund balance in the general fund. We rarely see that kind of cash there. One of the reasons that the governor has explained is the concern that there could be a recession at some point in this calendar year, so wanting to hold on to some more cash to help mitigate the impact of any recession if it hits. In addition to the general fund balance, there's also $2.5 billion in the rainy day fund, which is equivalent to 10% of general fund revenues, which has generally been sort of the accepted level to have in the rainy day fund to be able to kind of muddle through the first couple of years of a recession. So there's a lot of cash reserves between the $3.3 billion there to help us get through any kind of downturn. That's really the highlights on that page. If you turn to the next page, there's a chart there that highlights that a significant portion of the governor's budget plan requires legislation. There's targeted tax relief as well as some spending that's contingent on legislation. So on the tax relief side, the biggest item, $151 million of annual revenue loss, is to extend the earned income tax credit enhancements that were enacted back in 2021. And they were done then as sort of a temporary bridge to get through COVID. The governor's proposing to extend those. They provide a larger refundable tax credit to low-income families and individuals. So the governor's extending that, and along with that, he's extending another bill that was enacted in 2021 that allowed people without a Social Security number to qualify for the EITC. So he's also extending that. That's all rolled up into that $151 million impact. The second major tax proposal, and we don't have bills yet, so it's a little shaky in all the details. Military retirement income would be largely exempted from the income tax under the governor's plan. Currently, you exempt $15,000 in military retirement income for people 55 and older, and $5,000 for those under 55. Based on the fiscal estimate, he's going to exempt almost all military retirement income from the income tax under his proposal. The third tax credit change is to expand the state's child tax credit. The current credit is very small. Eligibility is limited to disabled children and family income below $6,000. So very few families qualify for that. We don't know the details of what the expansion that the governor is proposing is, but they've estimated it'll cost 20 million. So we look forward to seeing the details so we can evaluate that estimate. In terms of the spending contingent on legislation, the big item is the couple of years back, the General Assembly passed a bill that phased us up to a $15 minimum wage by calendar 2025. The governor is proposing to accelerate that to October of this calendar year, to get to 15 in October. And there's a big general fund cost there because one of the things that the General Assembly did when you passed that bill to move to the $15 was to provide annual rate increases for developmental disability, behavioral health, and a lot of other Medicaid providers to give them rate increases so they kind of keep pace with the rising minimum wage. So the governor wants to accelerate those rate increases that were scheduled for fiscal 25 and 26 into fiscal 24. That acceleration is worth an 8% rate increase for those providers, and it costs about $200 million. So that's all contingent, all that spending is contingent on your approving the acceleration of the minimum wage increase. The other big item is $50 million related to the Medicaid hospital assessment. The state generates about $394 million a year through an assessment on hospitals, goes into a special fund, and is used to help fund Medicaid costs. The hospitals, as I'm sure you've heard, some are having trouble complying with this federal waiver that we're under. So as a temporary reprieve, the governor is proposing to reduce that assessment by $50 million for 1 year only. And there's a Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act that will include that provision. There's some smaller items there. We don't have a lot of detail. The Maryland Educator Shortage Act is a teacher recruitment initiative. I don't know how it's structured exactly, but it's estimated it'll cost about $15 million. So hopefully in the next week or two, you'll see the bills come in and there'll be more details on the legislative package. So those are the big additional spending items. There's one additional savings item. The governor is required by law to appropriate over $1 billion into the state's rainy day fund this year. Since we're already at 10%, he's asking again in a BRFA that we waive that requirement. He would cut 61 million of that appropriation, just cut it to fall to the bottom line. He reinvests the other $1 billion into two big initiatives. One is 500 million set aside for transportation capital needs, and 500 million to be transferred to the state's Blueprint Fund, which is the special fund that helps fund the Kerwin education reform initiatives that were passed a couple of years back. I'm going to turn to the next slide, next page. And this is probably the most important takeaway from this document, which is it looks at the state's structural budget outlook. So that's comparing ongoing revenues to ongoing spending. And the blue bars are the administration's forecast, and they had a positive fund balance every year. But what they didn't include in their forecast, but they did acknowledge in their documents, is that the Blueprint Fund doesn't have enough money to cover all of the Kerwin education reform costs in fiscal 27 and fiscal 28. So when the Blueprint Fund doesn't have enough money, those costs fall onto the general fund. And that's what results in that red line with a big structural budget challenge in fiscal 27 and 28, approaching $1 billion in 27 and over $1 billion in 28. For those of you who've been around before, this is not an unusual circumstance where we have structural budget deficits forecast in the out years. What was surprising is, for those of you who were on Spending Affordability Committee in December, was a much rosier forecast was presented then. And the big thing that's changed is highlighted in the graphic on the next page. So one of the things that drives our education formulas is the number of students in the public schools who qualify for free and reduced price meals. And the number of students this fall who qualify for free and reduced price meals jumped by 110,000 students. That's about a 34% increase. It means that 51% of all students in the public schools in Maryland are free and reduced price meal eligible now. And in terms of budget impact, there's a part of the education formulas that's a compensatory education formula that provides additional money to school systems for serving lower income students. And so that grows by $390 million in this year's budget, and presumably that's an ongoing cost each subsequent year. So that's what's kind of changed our longer term budget outlook, as the Blueprint Fund gets exhausted much faster paying for these higher compensatory education costs. So what happened? So the major reason for this big jump is that for the first time ever, and this was something required in the Kerwin legislation, the state matched the Medicaid enrollment numbers for kids against the public school enrollment. And they identified all of these additional kids who meet the income eligibility criteria for free and reduced price meals, but had not, signed up for them. So that's, we believe, is the driver of this huge increase. And I would say it's pretty much seen across the state, with the exception of 3 jurisdictions. Every county saw at least a 20% jump in their free and reduced price meal counts. Some saw much more substantial increases. Just as an example, Anne Arundel County has more than 10,000 additional kids free and reduced price meals now. The exception to that is there were 3 jurisdictions, Baltimore City, Wacomico County, and I think it's Dorchester County, who did not see a jump or saw very small jumps. Primary reason is, I'll use the city as an example, more than 85% of the kids in the city were already free and reduced price meals, so they were already doing a great job of capturing their low-income students, so there wasn't really the room for them to go up very much. All right, so on the next slide, the other thing that was projected back in December was a $3.6 billion surplus for fiscal '24 after paying for all the mandates and kind of known expenditures that would be incurred. So what we try to show you here is what did the governor do with that money? So the biggest chunk of the money goes to what I would call initiatives and enhancements, and I've talked about quite a few of these already. The 2 $500 million allocations for transportation capital, for the Blueprint Fund, the provider rate increases tied to the minimum wage acceleration, and then the tax relief proposals that I mentioned. I'm just going to highlight a couple of other things in the chart. One is the governor put quite a bit more money into public higher education than we were projecting in December, about $133 million more. And that was across the public 4 years. USM, Morgan, St. Mary's all received very healthy increases. And that flows through to our community college formula. So overall, community colleges are going to get about a $40 million increase in their funding this year. Another thing that's worth mentioning is there's a K through 12 education hold harmless, because there are actually 2 school systems whose overall education aid was going to decline from 23 to 24. The 2 school systems are Baltimore City, which gets a $32 million hold harmless, and Allegheny County, which gets a $5 million hold harmless. In the city, part of the effort is, the issue is their education effort amount went down by, I think it's about $90 million from last year to this year. In Allegheny County, the reason is apparently that somebody won the Powerball or Mega Millions, and they had a one-time huge blip in their income, so they look much wealthier for 1 year than they did before. That will go away in a year, but for now, that was an interesting blip. The other area of kind of additional expenditure that wasn't initiatives is just some sort of higher estimates of costs, particularly in Medicaid and behavioral health. Governor has put about $400 million more than we were anticipating in to just cover costs in both the current fiscal year and in the fiscal '24 budget, partly because he's expecting more people to be enrolled than DLS was estimating back in December. And the budget analysts will be digging into that further and make recommendations to budget and tax in terms of what's the appropriate funding level. So let's go on to the next page, which is just a series of bullets that hits some other highlights in the budget. I'll leave it mainly for you to just peruse at your leisure. A couple of things I will mention. Tuition at the public 4-year institutions is capped for in-state students at 2%. That covers all of the public 4-year schools. I mentioned the community college growth. The other thing is state employee salaries. So the governor is providing a 2% cost of living increase for all state employees effective July 1. The law enforcement officers bargaining unit had previously negotiated with Governor Hogan a 5% increase, and that is honored in the budget. That went back a year ago that was negotiated. Employee increments are funded for most employees. So for most employees, that's a 2 to 4% salary increase on top of the COLA. And all of that costs almost $400 million. The other thing that's funded is something that Governor Hogan did back in November, which was to provide all employees with a 4.5% COLA. There was no actual money in the fiscal '23 budget to fund that COLA. So Governor Moore has provided the funding in fiscal '23, and then it's an ongoing expense, so he funded it in fiscal '24. That cost over $600 million in this year's budget. So there's a substantial investment in state employees. As most of you probably know, the state has got about 13% of all state positions vacant at the moment. So part of this, both Governor Hogan's actions and the additional increases that Governor Moore is proposing, is trying to make the state competitive in the very difficult job market we have in the state right now. On the capital budget, there's $1.2 billion of general obligation bonds, which is what the Spending Affordability Committee recommended. It's supplemented by more than $1 billion of general and special fund cash, so there's a very robust capital budget again this year. It's also worth just noting the governor set aside $150 million for legislative initiatives across operating and capital. So it'll be up to the General Assembly how it uses that money. But there is some money that's just earmarked for you all to decide how to spend. And then the final page that I was going to talk about with some more bullets, just the kind of major fiscal issues for the General Assembly this session, certainly for the budget committees. The first is that long-term sustainability of the budget and thinking that through. The second is obviously the legislative package, since there's a significant fiscal impact related to all those proposals. Trying to figure out what else can be done to improve the state's hiring and retention. The sufficiency of the Medicaid budget, and the last one I would highlight is just this is the first year the General Assembly can kind of reallocate money in the budget on its own. So that will be a new experience for certainly the budget committees and for all of you in terms of being able to actually add things into the budget that are your priorities. So there's a very long document that follows. That's the really 10,000-foot level look, Madam Chair, and I'm happy to answer any questions the members have.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Mr. Romans. I think Senator Lamb, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So I had a question about you were talking about the farms, the free and reduced meals students. And I guess you had said that now 51% of students across the state qualify for farms?
Yes, sir.
And you were citing the fact that because of the increase in farm students, that was going to cost the state an additional $390 million, is that right?
The compensatory education formula goes up, and it's by $390 million. Most of it is driven by the additional students. There are some tweaks in the payment per student that were already in the law, but most of that cost is the growth in those students.
The growth in the additional farm students, I
Farm
guess,
students,
right?
yes,
Okay.
correct.
I'm trying to remember back my days on appropriations and because everything is formula driven, right? And so the farm students are used as some kind of a benchmark or measure to drive certain formulas, I guess, right? And that's what drives this to the $390 million.
Exactly.
Okay. Because it has nothing to do with the actual meals that people are qualifying for under free and reduced meals. It's not $390 million in meals. It's the fact that these students, because they now are farms eligible or farms qualified, it's driving other formula changes that hits the 390.
Exactly, because the formulas use it as sort of a proxy for disadvantaged students, and then the state gives more money for each disadvantaged student that a school system is serving.
Okay. My other question pertained to you mentioned that there was a hospital assessment reduction, I guess, for the state, or it's an expenditure for the state of $50 million because it's a reduced hospital assessment on the hospitals themselves by $50 million. So that's because we heard from the HSCRC the other day that they were basically requiring hospitals to take some reductions to drive some cost savings. And so this, in effect, is to help offset some of those?
Yes, I mean, I think this was part of what the HSCRC had proposed, is this is a way to kind of help soften the blow for the hospitals by.
Oh, I see. Okay, so part of the mechanism that the HSCRC was suggesting using to help bring us back under compliance of the waiver was to include this, which was a cost savings for hospitals.
For
of $50 million.
hospitals, and the state backfills the money, yeah, in terms of the
Got it.
Medicaid program.
Okay, as a one-time kind of
Right.
measure, I guess. Okay. So the expectation is that there will be a BRFA, it sounds like.
There is a BRFA, it just includes two things. It includes the hospital assessment change, and it includes this, getting the governor out from having to fund the rainy day fund appropriation of over $1 billion, in which he then uses that money for other things.
Okay. On page 7, you'd mentioned, or in this table, there's a line in here, I'm looking for it. Agencies retained fiscal 2023 vacancy savings of
Yeah.
114 million. What is, can you
Yeah,
describe that a little
so,
bit?
so as I mentioned during the presentation, we have a really extraordinary number of state positions vacant right now. We believe it's the highest level of state vacancies that we've ever had. It's about 13% of all state positions. The Governor Hogan, when he put the budget together last year for the current fiscal year, only assumed about 8% of positions would be vacant. So the agencies have the money to fill a substantial amount of vacancies. They just haven't been able to do so. So they're sitting on a large chunk of cash. The administration, the new administration chose to leave that money with the agencies. And I think one of the questions that we're going to be exploring in our budget analyses is, what are the agencies going to do with that money? Some of them may have like higher overtime costs because they don't have enough staff, so they have to pay, pay overtime. But others may be planning to reinvest it in other ways, and so that's going to be one of the areas of focus, is what's going on with this
Okay.
sort of temporary surplus.
And on these two large items on that page, the 500 million of transportation capital needs and the 500 being transferred to Blueprint, is there any more specificity with regards to how that will be spent, or is it just kind of an allocation now with what the actual spend will be determined later?
So on the Blueprint Fund, it's putting more cash in there to help cover all the Kerwin costs. So it helps to fund all of the Kerwin education reform expenses that otherwise would be funded with general funds. So it's just sort of
But these
cash.
were expected expenditures that we would require for Kerwin, right?
Correct, they're all mandated expenditures, yes. So there's no sort of policy change there, it's just a funding mechanism to continue to implement those reforms. The transportation is just transportation capital. It does not specify what project or projects would be funded with that money. It's just put into what the state calls a dedicated purpose account, which can be spent over multiple years.
Okay. So it's not the Transportation Trust Fund, it's
It is
just
not
kind
in
of
the
a
Transportation
separate
Trust Fund, correct,
account that is being held for.
right.
So it could go anything from Purple Line to highways to infrastructure needs, et cetera.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, all right. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hershey and then Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to go back on the questions about the farm students, you mentioned that the increase was related to a matched Medicaid number. Can you explain that?
Right, so the state's been working the last few years as a result of the Blueprint Fund Kerwin legislation to do the IT necessary to take the Medicaid enrollment numbers for people who are income eligible for farms, which is 185% and below, and match that against the enrollment in each school system in the fall. And this is the first time that they had gotten the technology done and were able to do that match. And that resulted in the identification of many students who had not sort of self-identified through the paperwork that families would submit as farms eligible, but who meet the income eligibility for farms.
Okay, so it was more of a families not self-identifying so it wasn't that we had that many more families be Medicaid eligible. They were already Medicaid eligible, and we just didn't know that they had students that would have been able to participate in farm?
Yeah, the school systems just didn't know that they were that low income that they would qualify for farms. Was the
Okay.
missing piece. Now, I would just add, the one little wrinkle on Medicaid is, as I think most of you on this committee know, is since the pandemic began, the Medicaid hasn't disenrolled anybody unless they died or moved out of state, and that's been a federal requirement, that you couldn't disenroll because we were getting enhanced federal funding for Medicaid. They're going to start disenrolling people this spring as required by federal legislation. So, in a year from now, there might be, I don't think it'll be a big number down, but there might be fewer children enrolled in Medicaid, and that may reduce somewhat the number of kids who qualify for farms next fall. But, well, it just remains to be seen how many kids will fall off of Medicaid as they start doing redeterminations.
Okay. Do you know if the number of children that are eligible for farm has any relation to the wealth formula that's used to determine the local share of funding for Kerwin?
It doesn't play into the wealth formula itself, no. The wealth is based on local resources, you know.
Okay, so the number of the students that are in a system, the county could be considered wealthy based on other factors, yet they could have a very high level of students that are in the farm program.
Potentially, yes. Yes.
Okay. All right, and then finally, one other thing. You mentioned something about, and I'm sorry I didn't get it, no social security number. We did something different. What is that?
So back in 2021, when the earned income tax credit was being enhanced, a separate bill was passed that made people who lacked a social security number eligible to apply and receive the state EITC benefit. Those people are not eligible for federal benefits because they don't have a social security number.
And we changed that through some type of policy to say that even though they're not eligible at the federal level, that we're going to consider them eligible?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Ellis.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Romans, for this briefing. My question goes back to the transportation area and the $500 million. And also, every year, the Maryland Department of Transportation sends to us their consolidated transportation plan. What does the law says as far as our impact on the consolidated transportation plan, and could we potentially have a say here in the General Assembly on any movement of that $500 million?
Right, so at the moment, the Consolidated Transportation Plan that came out at the start of session does not include the $500 million because it's not in the Transportation Trust Fund. It's off here on the side, and it requires some legislation for this to happen. So the General Assembly, again, now that you have the authority to reallocate funds in the budget, you can kind of do what you want with that $500 million if you want to steer it towards certain things. But, you know, that'll be a decision for the General Assembly.
Yeah, and the, thanks for that. And the Consolidated Transportation Plan. So I know the Transportation Department, they go and have this long process, including the road tour, where they go to every jurisdiction in Maryland and listen to our needs and basically consolidate that into their report to us. So that report that comes to us, where does it go specifically in the General Assembly? Do you know that? And what action is taken? Or do we need to approve it as a body?
So the fiscal '24 budget for the Department of Transportation, that will be in front of Budget and Tax, includes all of the spending that shows up in the transportation plan as fiscal '24 spending. So that is in front of the committee. The rest of the years of that plan is just the plan that shows, you know, what would come beyond. So the only thing that's really in front of the General Assembly right now is that the first year of that plan, the
Okay,
'24.
Great, well, thank you.
Sure.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Lamb for another bite.
Just one more question. The governor, by executive order, is proposing to create a Department for Service and Civic Innovation. Is there any funding in the budget proposed that would go towards that newly proposed department?
Yes. There's a deficiency appropriation for the current year that's like $3.5 million to kind of get that department started. And then there's about $14 million in the fiscal '24 budget to, you know, for a full year of
So
the new
about
department.
$3 million this year and $14 million next year?
Yeah.
Okay. How much of that was coming from, because it looked like it was an Office of like Service and Civic Engagement before, within the Governor's Office of Community Initiatives, that's now being elevated to be a department. Was the $3 million kind of the original funding that was in that office within GOCI before, or was this
The
additional?
deficiency is new money on top of
It's new
whatever is
money
going to
on
be
top.
transferred into the new department. We need to dig into the $14 million for fiscal '24 a little further. I think there's some money that's perhaps being moved from other places in the budget into the department, and some money that's you know, new money for additional costs the new department will incur.
What about the funding for the Maryland Corps program, which used to fall under parts of the statute that now would be subsumed by this new department?
There's a mandate in statute for this year of $5 million for Maryland Corps. The mandate was fully funded. That's on top of the $14 million in this department.
So that's In addition to the 14 million?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so 3 million, 14 million, and then the 5 million for Meloncourt will continue.
Yep.
Okay. All right, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I see no other questions for members. I just have a quick one, and I think it's quick, but I'm trying to get an understanding, kind of going back to early in your presentation, you were talking about the changes to the federal Medicaid match and the impact on the budget, the 6.2% that we have been giving, and that's going to be reduced. And then I was trying to follow that when you, on page 7, we're talking about the higher estimates for mandates and entitlements, and kind of trying to put those pieces together and get a sense of what the long-term implication of both of those actions are. Can you help me understand that?
Yeah, so the fiscal '24 has about 550 million of additional general funds to backfill for the loss of that enhanced federal match. So 550 million roughly is the federal funds that go away that we're backfilling. On top of that issue being resolved, the governor is assuming much higher expenditures related to Medicaid and behavioral health across both fiscal '23 and '24. That's unrelated to that. It just thinks there's going to be more people and higher costs of serving those people. When we did our forecast, which was back in October, we did not see the trend that the administration is seeing, but they had more months of data, so that it's perfectly possible that their numbers are correct. But we'll have a couple more months of data, when we do our analysis, so we will take a close look at what's going on with the trend, what the enrollment levels are, what the right amount is.
Okay, thanks. I think I got that. And then the other question that I had, and over the years from being across the street and back over, we've had these charts over the years of, structural deficits and all of that. So just trying to get a sense, if I understood you correctly, if you take out the changes that we made in the blueprint, we would not in fact be looking at a structural deficit, even with the mandates and the spending that we know we're going to have to do based on our estimated revenues. We would not be looking at a structural deficit, but for the education.
Right, the cost of the education reform and then all these additional students in the farms program is just driving is what's driving the structural deficit. Everything else was going along just fine in terms of being fundable long-term.
Okay, and if I remember, we had put something in the education, the reform package that said if these certain scenarios happen, then some things would not take place. But I think, did we not meet those? We met all those thresholds for full implementation of the
Right, because those were
reform
tied to
package.
like general fund revenue performance, and our revenues are
They've been
going
great.
along merrily, the last few years. So there's not a problem in terms of general funds coming in. Like I say, really, you wouldn't have this deficit forecast if the farms numbers hadn't jumped. We would be okay through fiscal '28, but that huge jump that no one was forecasting has a huge cost.
Right, and sort of something none of us could have predicted, but
Right.
all of us want to meet the needs of the state, so here we are. Last question in this very long one question that I was asking, then this is just curious. How are we doing with mandates once you remove the education reform mandate? And when you look at the overall budget, what are we looking at in terms of mandates, mandated spending?
Yeah, more than half of state spending is mandated. And when you include the entitlements, it's about 70% of all state spending is either for, a mandate where the governor has to put a certain amount in, or for entitlement programs, Medicaid being the biggest of the entitlement programs.
And the other 50 is the bills that we passed that we
Right. Yes.
put fiscal.
And
notes
all
on.
the formulas, like education, community colleges, you have all these formulas in law that distribute money mainly to locals, but
We do love our formulas here in Maryland. Thank you. Senator Vital.
Madam Chair. Mr. Romans, thank you for the presentation. I'm going to go back to the increase of free and reduced lunch to farms. And your note says, as a result, the compensatory education component of the state's K through 12 formulas grows by $390 million. Will we get a new update by county, how much then we're going to be contributing to each county?
yes, and in fact, let's see if I can find it. There is a local aid section in the report.
And it's the updated numbers?
Yeah, I don't know if I have the same numbering. It's my page 35 shows, it just shows a map really, but it shows you per capita state aid by county. The slide before it shows the programmatic growth. That's before the appendices. There you go. So on the screen, you see the graphic that just shows the overall per capita aid by counties. You can see the counties. There's also, if you want to see the real nitty-gritty detail for fiscal '24, there are a series of appendices on local government. I think it starts with appendix like 14, that show by school system the growth in education, or change in education funding.
And that's what I was looking for, but it includes the 390 million now distributed.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So just as an example, Anne Arundel County goes up about $62 million in education aid.
That's what I was looking for. Thank you.
And I'll just finally, as some of you make here, Appendix 17 shows for each school system the enrollment overall for the public schools, and then separately on the same chart, it shows you the free and reduced price meal enrollment count, so you can see what went on in your county.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Guile?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not to belabor the farms too much, but I do have a question. So my understanding, and I'm not that familiar with how the program worked, but during the time period of COVID, there was federal money, right, for all children, all students were receiving. I'm just wondering, so the time period on this chart where it says fall 2020 and fall 2021, where it dropped,
Right.
is that the reason why, is because during that time period that they're receiving the federal covering all students?
Yes, we think a lot fewer families went to the trouble of filling out the forms
Sure.
because the children were already getting the benefit anyway. So there
Okay.
was definitely a drop-off that we think was largely due to not needing to complete the forms to get the benefit. So there was an expectation that some kids would come back this year now that those enhanced federal benefits are going away. But the Medicaid match, obviously brought in many, many more students.
Okay, so the big jump, do you attribute that in some ways from that change, from it going from the federal covering all students to no longer covering all students? I guess I'm trying to understand. I mean, it's a sizable jump, and I'm just trying to figure out the route.
I think that, 10, 20,000 of that jump is probably just the kids, like families going to the trouble of filling out the forms, because now if they wanted their children to get a free or
Right.
reduced price meal, they needed to fill out the form. And then on top of that, and the bulk of this, I would say probably 80,000, 90,000 of this is that we had never matched Medicaid rolls against public school, and there were obviously a lot of families who didn't self-identify as being poor enough for their child to qualify for a free and reduced price meal, but actually do have low enough income to qualify.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional questions for Mr. Roman? Well, we got them. All right, looks like none. Thank you so much for your presentation. We'll probably be in touch offline individually, but thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues, we're going to have to pause for just a moment. We were having a glitch with our visual part of our AV system, so we're going to have to shut down and restart in just a moment, and then we'll do the second part of our briefing.